Welcome everyone to our last episode, episode 14 of the fall 2015 virtual office hours. My name is John Fia. Abby Blakeney, our producer, is behind the camera. We have the founding fathers here as usual, including the George Washington bobblehead. If you want to give a Christmas gift to the virtual office hours, you can give us bobbleheads for these other Pez dispensers too. Maybe we'll go back to the Pez dispensers in the new year. Anyway, we have been talking all fall, all semester, about the idea that America was founded, or the idea that America is a Christian nation. And we've been tracing that idea through American history all the way up to the 1960s and 1970s. Today, in our last episode, we want to talk a little bit more about the rest of the story, leading maybe up to the present day. When we left off last time, we were talking about the emergence of the Christian right, and the idea that America is a Christian nation is really contested for the first time in the 60s and 70s for some of the things. Go back and look at last week's episode. From this point forward now, you are going to see strong defenders of the idea that America is a Christian nation, and it's usually associated with the rise of conservative or Republican politics. In other words, Republicans, at least the Christian factions of the Republican Party, are going to make very hard and strong arguments for the idea that we're a Christian nation and we need to get back to those Christian roots. Now, how do they do this? Well, what you're going to see from about 1980, and it still goes on all the way up to the present, really is a fourfold argument. One is they are going to argue about providential history. The so-called Christian Nationalists, that we'll call them, defenders of Christian America, are going to argue that God is somehow orchestrating human history. The sovereignty of God is controlling all things, and we need to acknowledge that in our textbooks, and we need to think more deeply about the way in which God played a role in the creation of this republic. So this is tied also to things like American exceptionalism, the idea that America is somehow specially blessed by God, or maybe it's a new Israel or a city on a hill, all of these things, but appealing to God's providence and special relationship with the United States. Now, secondly, I mentioned textbooks. There then becomes an assault on public school textbooks for leaving out religion, for leaving out God, for leaving out all of those so-called Christian developments in the history of the United States. And you see a strong attempt to write alternative histories that are going to be used for Christian schools and home schools. But you also see then an attempt, especially in places like Texas and other large states that teach a lot of kids United States history, an attempt to try to get the public school textbooks changed to have more references to God and Christianity within them. I think a third argument, the third and fourth arguments are really historical arguments. Many of these Christian nationalists are going to try to argue that the founding fathers of the United States were Christians, and thus, if they were Christians, the logic goes, it's actually pretty bad logic, but the logic goes, if they were Christians, they must have established or wanted to have established a Christian nation. So we can prove that people like John Adams or George Washington, or even in the case of one recent book by David Barton called The Jefferson Lies, if we can even get Thomas Jefferson, where's Jefferson here? We could even get him to be a Christian. Is that him? Yeah. We can show that America indeed was meant to be founded as a Christian nation. So again, this appeal to the founding era to show all of the so-called Christian influences. And then finally, also in the founding era, an attempt to show that the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States are somehow built upon Judeo-Christian values. And we'll probably talk a little bit more about that in our spring 2016 season, when we actually dive into the ideas of the founding fathers and the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and so forth. So this is the argument that the Christian nationalists are making. At least this is the core of their argument. Now, very early on in the 80s especially, this Christian America idea was promoted by all kinds of ministers and politicians, people like Tim LaHaye, who was California political activists and pastor, people like Francis Schaeffer, James Kennedy in Florida, and Peter Marshall, who wrote a series of books, one the most famous being The Light and the Glory, to talk about, yes, look at the religious and providential foundings of America. They've all kind of passed off the scene, and now the torch has been taken up, I think, most prominently by a man named David Barton, who we just mentioned before, and his organization called Wall Builders. Barton is a political operative who uses the past and cherry picks from the past to try to promote the idea that America is a Christian nation. Much more of a politician than a historian, but there are many on the Christian right who believe he is a historian who is telling them things about the founding that they're not going to get in their secular education, whether it be in high school or in college. So today, someone like David Barton is sort of carrying the torch, promoting this idea of America being a Christian nation and the so-called Judeo-Christian heritage of the United States, and have been very successful, I think, in doing this along the way. So again, if you think back to last episode, since 1960 and 1970, very much this idea of Christian America is now contested. The culture wars has begun, and history plays a fundamental role in the culture wars, as you have Christian right, led today by someone like David Barton, trying to reclaim the idea that America is a Christian nation from the so-called secular forces that he believes are trying to undermine that. And that, I think, brings us up to the present on this whole question of how America has understood itself, or not understood itself in some cases, to be a Christian nation. What we will try to do in our Spring 2016 series is then go back to the 18th century, as I mentioned before, and think about the founders, think about the documents and so forth, and really get at, try to answer the question now. We've looked at it historically. Let's try to examine the question, well, what did the founding documents and the founders believe about the relationship between religious faith and the American experience, or the American experiment that they were trying to create. So thanks for watching all fall. Merry Christmas to all of you. Happy holidays to all of you. Happy New Year. And we will probably see you sometime in January here on the Virtual Office Hours.